Our work really looks at the relationship between women's rights and technology. And I'm here today, as I've been introduced, to talk about the centrality of media and ICTs in any conversations talking about development. And I want to start just by reminding us of a few things in relation to why we are at a really important moment in 2015. And that has got to do with the convergence of a series of instruments which are really critical for women's rights. The first is Beijing Plus 20. The second is the ending of the MDGs and the review. The third is the post-2015 forward-looking processes. And also importantly for us is the issue of WSIS, which is the World Summit on the Information Society. And it's an acronym that's not often heard in women's rights spaces, and I think it's a pity, but I'll speak a bit more about that now. One of the things we are concerned with, both as APC and also as someone from SADC and who has worked with gender links in the past, is that there really has been a deprioritization of any conversations around gender and media and ICTs. And in some ways it's understandable, right? Why talk about media and technology when we have the highest levels of violence against women? When we have black lesbians dying every day in countries all through the region? When we know that people are hungry and starving. So the question really is for us to look at why should we centralize it, and why should we really begin looking at media and ICTs as a very important politicized issue for us to be talking about. Now I just want to take us back to what we have now. And what we have now is Section J in the Beijing Platform for Action. And just to remind us of the two strategic objectives. The first is to increase participation and access of women to expression and decision-making in and through the media and through new technologies of communication. And the second is to promote a balanced and non-stereotypical view of women in the media. I was really glad to hear Jessica talking about social norms, because often it's a very interesting and easy entry point into talking about why the media is so central. We know it's a key socializing agent. And apart from that, it also sets the agenda in some ways. It gives us a view of the world that helps us see ourselves through a very particular lens. And when the representation we see of ourselves is already skewed, what is that telling us? So just to keep that in mind as we begin to talk. So what are the things that we do know? We know that less than a quarter of those heard or read about in print, radio, and television across the globe are women. Less than a quarter. Already something's wrong. We know that nearly half of stories reinforce gender stereotypes. And that's nearly 8 times higher than stories that challenge gender stereotypes. Again, we're talking about social norms. We know that 73% of top management jobs in media companies are occupied by men. And these statistics come from the International Women's Media Foundation and also the Global Gender and Media Study, which are very recent tools. We also know that the internet and technology have changed how we live, how we love, and how we play. And that's also really for us to keep centralized in this conversation. 25 years ago, we celebrated, well, this week we celebrated 25 years of the internet. And that was a really significant moment because it really has changed a number of different things. And as we celebrated, we were reminded of the optimism that the internet gave us. Oh my gosh, finally we have a time to shift things. Yeah? We will make our own media. We will be present. We will shift how we are represented. And 25 years later, can we really say that after the statistics I've given us? No, we can't. In SADC in particular, there is a huge movement and lots of conversations around access. Access to infrastructure, access to the internet. But what's really problematic is that those conversations happen outside of conversations around access to content and access to decision making. And who decides what's important for whom when? Who decides what languages are privileged in these conversations around access? And also very important is who decides what is developed? In Southern Africa, there's a real push around mobile technology, but there's no conversations around, so what can you not get on a mobile? And if we're pushing mobiles, at what cost? The internet has also given us, well, not only the internet, but new technologies, has created spaces for us to really begin to Sorry, I lost my train of thought, so I'm going to leave it and I'm going to go on to the next point. Another point just to mention is that in sub-Saharan Africa in 2011, there were twice as many men as women on the internet. And yet at the same time, we hear all the time about women in mobiles as the big kind of push. Yet that hasn't changed that statistic at all. We also know that there is very little useful disaggregated data available. There is data, as Jessica was saying, there's lots and lots of it. But it's not used in particular ways. And some of it actually is not useful, depending on what it is we want to use it for. And that also is something for us to remember. A few other things that we know. In a recent survey that the APC did looking at the value of the internet for sexual rights activists, in a sample of 359 responses, we found that 98% of sexual rights activists say the internet is an important public space for advancing sexual rights. We also know that 51% of them have received violent or threatening messages. We also know that as more women get online, more women are also beginning to get offline because of cyber harassment and threats and misogyny. And a really good example in the UK recently was the big Twitter outrage that really brought to the fore some of the really problematic norms and values that are just being reproduced on the internet. And the purpose of many of those misogynistic comments is exactly the same that happens to us in the streets. It's to silence us. It's to say, you have no right to be here. It's to say, leave. And we really are beginning to see that happening in huge numbers. So as the opportunity is still presenting itself to us, so is the moment for us to be able to respond, to say, actually, we aren't going anywhere. Also important in this conversation is to be quite aware of the fact, and I'm really glad to see Rachel here, a partner in Kenya, is that women journalists are also a particular category of women who are experiencing misogynistic threats online. And what is being used? The same old thing, our sexuality. Look what she does, she has no right to say that. So particular kinds of tactics that target reputation using age-old strategies that patriarchy has always used. But no one's having these conversations because the internet and the media, they're not so important. We've got other things to worry about. And this is why we really think that we need to centralize this conversation, and we really applaud the Southern African movement for being the SADC Gender Protocol, for being really at the forefront of beginning to make these issues very centralized. Because unless we are able to understand what's happening, develop the kind of data that is useful and necessary for us, as Jessica said earlier on, there are going to be no resources. And 20 years from now, when we're still trying to hold the same line, we're going to have exactly the same conversation. So really my appeal to all of us is just to think about why these other, but might appear peripheral issues, actually aren't peripheral. And if we're talking about Beijing Plus 20, we're talking about any indicators of any kind developed for whatever reason, we have to centralize media and ICTs. Thank you.